Welcome back to History B354, the Reformation. This is the first lecture of the second week. And the title for the lecture today is The Crisis of the Later Middle Ages. Now, a couple of points here, prefatory points in many ways. This entire period from approximately 1300 till we can almost say the later part of the 16th century was a period of crisis. Now, what that means is that basic structures of society, which had always assumed would be would be working, were becoming very clear that they weren't working. And that leads to a feeling of crisis. We overuse the word crisis so often in our society. We're constantly in a state of crisis, and that's not to belittle it. But we would come to college and we have our freshman crisis, and then we have our sophomore crisis, and junior crisis, and senior crisis, and then we go on out into the world, and then we end up and we have our midlife crisis, and on we go. Footnote: I don't think I've ever had a midlife crisis, but that's another issue. But the point being is that general use of the term crisis, or this is a real crisis, um, is overused. And in this sense that I'm using it here and with reference to the next several weeks of this course, it really is something more fundamental. Just for an example, we talk about in this country, there's been talk about we are getting close to a constitutional crisis. At times, it has been in terms of the election and the overturning of the election, a real constitutional crisis. Now, we haven't gotten there yet. We may still end up in one. But my point here is that there have been many crises in the history of this country, but there's only been one crisis, and that was the Civil War, when the very foundation of the country was in jeopardy and at risk. That's just an indication of what I'm trying to get at here with the term crisis as I apply it to the later Middle Ages. Because this was a period when increasingly it was clear that something's wrong. Something is foundationally wrong with how we conceive of the world and our place in it. Now, this doesn't mean that everyone in society was pondering these issues and worried about the crisis. And again, for the most part, the vast majority of the population were simply worried about, what am I going to eat next week, and how do I make a living, and how do I get on with my life. But there became this general sense of something is foundationally wrong, and we have to try to figure out what that is. And that led to this sense of urgency and crisis. And that is a very difficult situation to be in. That's the situation that Europeans found themselves increasingly as we enter into the 14th century and beyond. And that is then part and parcel of what I've referred to as the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. Now, the reading for this week, if you look at the syllabus, is the introduction in chapter 1 of my book, Luther and the Reformation of the Later Middle Ages. That is posted. I think I talked about this either in the first lecture and or in the welcome lecture or in the introduction to the course document. The page proofs, the final proofs of my book, that book, are posted in Canvas in the module assigned readings. And there, so you can read that as you would anywhere. Some of the other readings I'll be posting in the week that they're quote unquote due or assigned. But for the two books that are assigned for this course, the Lutheran Reformation of the Later Middle Ages, and then my edition and translation of Jordan McQuedlinburg's Exposition of the Lord's Prayer, those are in that distinct module at the beginning, assigned readings. So you can just click on that. It's a PDF file, read the introduction and the chapter 1, and we'll go from there. And there you'll find more about the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, my conceptions of it, discussions of reform. And that will be then supplementing this part of the course in this lecture as we go through things. My lecture today is not lecturing on those readings. That's an additional assignment for part of the course material. Now, looking at it as I did reviewing the readings before I started this lecture right now, I thought this could be difficult if you have never heard of Martin Luther and if you really have no concept of what the Reformation was or when it was or what it was about. Now, I am not suggesting that there are people who have never heard of Martin Luther or John Calvin or the later Middle Ages or things like that. But it may be. There are no prerequisites for this course. And that is one of the problems we have. This is an upper division course. And so, on one level, there are expectations that people coming into such an upper division course will have a general background. They will have taken a course in Western civilization, for example. So they know the general development, so to speak, and some of the most important figures involved, at least to some extent, have some reference point. If I say John Calvin, if I say Erasmus, or if I say the Council of Trent, they'll have some context for recognizing those terms. But if you don't, that's not your fault by any way, shape, or form. And we don't, again, have any prerequisites on this course. So if you find yourself kind of asking, like, what do I do and what's going on, because I have no idea what any of this is talking about, that is where going to the suggested readings can help. The suggested reading of being Carter Lindbergh's textbook, The European Reformations, right here, and reading, I guess I'll give the introduction to chapter 1 there too, or something like that. And so I went back and thought, well, I better look at that. And in some ways, that too is assumes a lot of basic information or basic understanding or knowledge of general developments. So if you do find yourself having difficulties, saying, what are we talking about and what's this all about? If it's not clear to you from doing the assigned readings, from the lectures, then try, if you can, to get a hold of Lindbergh's textbook and look at that. And if that still is a bit too much, then we say, okay, well, there are free online Western Civ books. So if you need a suggestion for something like that, just let me know, write me, and we can see about one way or the other, making sure you have access to some sort of a Western Civ book that you could read the chapter on the Reformation or the Renaissance and Reformation to get just a general overview sense of what's going on in those terms. So please do not feel bad if you are lost by the reading, the assigned reading, or by the lecture, for that matter, as well. Or if you simply want to know more. I mean, that's the other aspect. So if you have any problems or issues, please do just email me and we can talk about it and we can try to make sure that we'll get you up to speed, so to speak, or hopefully make it so that you don't feel as lost as you might feel. Now, if you're not feeling lost, all the better. If you say, yeah, I'm no Luther, no problem, that's another issue. And so you don't have to worry about that. So with that being said, again, the assignments for today, for this week, are the introduction, chapter 1 of my book, Luther and the Reformation of the Later Middle Ages, which will be, again, important for actually your first text analysis, which is coming up in a couple of weeks, which will be on Jordan of Quedlinburg's exposition of the Lord's Prayer, which is the assigned reading for next week. So that's kind of where we are in terms of the assignments, what's coming up, what's due. But with this lecture, we really get today into the substance of the course. Last week, we did kind of a general introduction, and then the background, the basic structures of Christendom, which I'm trying to discuss and brief and in context. Some of the basic institutions, concepts, events that are important for understanding what this Reformation was all about, also in the late medieval period. So that's just trying to set the stage and set the scene for today, beginning with this general period of the crisis of the later Middle Ages. Just because not every lecture from here on out it will have the title "The Crisis of the Later Middle Ages" doesn't mean that it's not in some ways all part of it, if that makes any sense. Um, so I just want you to keep in mind that this is not a contained concept or idea, but it's looking at some of the origins and events that occurred that began this sense of, oh my God, something is fundamentally wrong. If you have read Shakespeare's play Hamlet, or if you've seen it performed, one of the most famous lines at the beginning is "something is rotten in the state of Denmark." And that was a crisis. It certainly was for Hamlet. And that is what I'm getting at in terms of something was rotten in late medieval Christendom. And how did that come about to be recognized, and how was it seen as a problem, and what was the impact of that experience? That is what we're looking at. So hopefully that will set the stage for a beginning. And I hope I don't have technical problems as I go back and forth between the PowerPoint slides and the camera. But so we begin then with the early 14th century and the slide famine. Now, there had been famines before in Europe, periods of hunger. But what happened in the early 14th century, and there I have the dates of 1317 to 1322, it really kind of starts a couple of years beforehand, was a famine that had not been really seen before. I may be going out on a limb here, but when I talk about famine, I'm not simply talking about being hungry. A famine, I said going out on a limb, assume that probably none of us in this course have ever experienced famine. We may have experienced hunger. We may have experienced, food insecurity. We may have missed meals. All kinds of issues regarding food and nutrition. But famine is something when people, die of hunger, and not in that metaphorical sense. Oh, I'm dying of hunger, but literally. And in this 5-year period, approximately 17 to 22, more or less, Northern Europe, not so much Southern Europe. So we're not talking about Spain and Italy, but north of the Alps, Northern Europe, especially in northern Germany, Scandinavian countries, England, by and large, some parts of northern France, experienced famine. Now, just to put this in perspective, how did this come along? Just out of the blue, out of the sky? No. Scholars have gone back, and we have seen that based on tree rings. There's this whole field of study, dendrochronology, looking at the development of tree rings. And so we can see the growth patterns. And beginning in about 1315 or so, there began to be a series of years of extraordinary heavy rains. You say, wouldn't that be good? Well, I don't know about any of you, but I grew up on a farm in Central California. And we grew grapes and walnuts and grapes for raisins. And, grapes would be picked by hand and dried in the sun. These are sun-made raisins, after all. Literally, we're Sun-Maid members and part of the co-op of Sun-Maid. And they were dried in the sun. So when you have your whole crop out on the ground on paper trays drying, and if it rains, that can cause problems. Because, yes, it gets wet, but then that wet molds, and you can't sell your moldy fruit. We lost our crop, I think, 3 times during my growing up period. Not 3 successive times, but 3 times when it rained, and there's nothing you can do about it. If there's just a little bit of rain, they get kind of wet. You can, there are things you can do so it won't be destroyed. But when you look down out into the field and see the rows, the rows of grapes and the rows of grapes drying on the ground and see that basically underwater, not the vines, but the trays. That's just a sickening feeling because there's nothing you can do about it. And that's your livelihood. I mean, we also had walnuts, so that was not all of our livelihood, but it was a substantial part of it. And you can survive losing your crop 1 year. And with today's mechanisms of crop insurance, of financial means of loans and things, you can get by. But if those things weren't there, you might still be able to survive losing your crop 1 year. But then if you lost it again the next year, that could be really then on the brink. And if you lost it the third year, it's over. Now, this we're talking about not just for the individual peasant farming, we're talking about the whole region. So it's the food supply of the region we're talking about. And the crops were gone. Hunger set in and famine really hit. And people were dying of hunger. And it's not the something I could ever imagine what that would be like, or certainly never wish it on anyone. But it led to stories. Anyway, I can't say that these have been confirmed, but accounts, texts talking about it got so bad there was cannibalism going on. You can think, oh my God, I would never do that. Things couldn't get so bad that I would eat people. Well, here we're not talking about going out and, finding somebody and killing them and roasting them on the spit and adding some barbecue sauce and saying, tastes like chicken, pretty good. That's not what this was about. Imagine you're in a famine. Imagine this is like 1319. You're, decent or had been decently not well off, but you were making a living as a peasant with your spouse and a couple of children, few children, 3 or 4 children, and you were in the midst of this famine, and your spouse dies of hunger. You don't have much left to hang on, and your children don't, and they're your children. No food, but your dead spouse. What would you do? That is a horrific decision to have to make. I don't know. I can't even fathom it. I mean, it's it either becomes trivial because we have to make it comic, or we turn it into some sort of horror scene in a movie. But if it was real, what would you do? I don't know. But you have a choice. Do you serve your children, your spouse, so that maybe they can live another day or two and maybe eventually get through it somehow? Or do you just accept that this is the end for us all? And I don't know. There's no right or wrong answer there, certainly. But when I talk about cannibalism in the context of the famine, that's what I'm getting at. And malnutrition, especially for the children, especially if you were young. If you survived, think of the effect that would have on children who survived the famine somehow. It's not all, it's not that everybody dies of hunger, but there were people who were dying of hunger and other people who were very close to that point. It's not like no one had any food whatsoever for 5 whole years. There were, storage and backups and things like that. But it was just a dire, dire situation. And for adults can come out of a famine pretty well. They can recover pretty well. Assuming that it doesn't last forever, certainly. But once the famine is over, if you've survived and if you're an adult, you can get back to almost normal life. But for children, it would be hard. very hard, because their whole development will be affected. So that's kind of what we're looking at in terms of a weakened population in Northern Europe as a result of the famine, even though we don't have any certain statistics on the number of deaths as a result of the famine. It was not insignificant, but it wasn't to the level of what was about to come. But it was an issue of significant impact on the health crisis, major health crisis, international health crisis in Northern Europe at the time. And we talk about, other periods of history when there were famines. We talk about the Great Potato Famine in Ireland and things. But it does have an impact that we cannot ignore if we're looking at history and how history develops in society and culture and peoples, as well as then, again, as I alluded to shortly ago, what was about to hit. And there we go from famine to plague. If you were, let's say, 10 years old in 1322, you'd have survived the famine. 10 years old in 1322, you'd have been, 5 years old in 1317. Maybe as it's starting, 3 or 4 years old when it's just beginning to have problems and issues. But by 1348, if you were 10 years old in 1322, oh, can I do the math here real quickly? That's 26 years. You would be 36 years old, right? Because we're talking about 20 years on, or 26 years on between 1322 and 1348. That's 26 years. So if you're 10, then you'd be 36. You'd be at the height of your adulthood and vigor, but you would have been weakened. And what happens in 1348, and then especially as it spreads in 1349, was something that had never happened before in living memory of anyone at the time, namely the arrival of the plague. This is a footnote. It's called the Black Death. It's not called the Black Plague. Never please refer to it as the Black Plague. It's the Black Death. So either the plague or the Black Death. And I have up there the dates for it, 1347 to 1350, because the earliest indications we have is that in Europe, in European sources, is its arrival in the ports of Italy, in Genoa and Venice, in approximately 1347. And we can chart its spread. Now, what is the plague? The plague we thought had been wiped out, but then every once in a while you hear individualized cases about it. Today, it's a serious problem, a disease, but we know how to deal with it, and we have antibiotics. So, people aren't dying of the plague. But this was an issue of massive death. It reached across Europe all the way up into England by 1349. And in aggregate, scholars have estimated that at least a third of the population of Europe died. That's a huge amount. I say, okay, let's see. There are 35 students registered in the course and me. So there's 36 of us. And if we came back, I won't say tomorrow overnight, but by the end of the course, if only 24 of us were left and the other 12 had died, that would be a huge issue, a huge issue. But some places in Europe, the death rate was even higher. It was up to 2/3, or even in Florence, it's estimated to be 80% of the population would died. Now, Europe had, as I think I indicated last lecture, talking about the medieval developments, been enjoying an ongoing population increase. Well, that population increase, that growing population, came to a dramatic halt in the mid 14th century with the plague, and it wasn't until the mid 15th century, or the end of the 15th century, that the population even began to reach the pre-plague levels. You can say, what's the issue with population? It's, well, you could say it's a Malthusian correction. People have talked about it in those terms. But either way, it was a horrendous event when you never know what's going to happen. You never know who's going to be dead tomorrow. If this were the plague, I mean, not saying all 12, all a third of us would die every day, but it'd be like, okay, we're going to meet again on Monday, let's say. Obviously, Monday is the first day of classes, and but if we were meeting in person, so to speak, and several people would have died from the plague between now and then. That's the type of issue, and then more people, and then more people. It affects you. You don't understand, especially when you don't understand it. That's the issue. What was this thing? What was going on, and why was it happening? Now, scholars at the time, scholars have since, modern scholars, have identified 3 different strains of plague: bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic. I have them up there. The bubonic plague would affect the lymphatic system in the body, the pneumonic, the lungs, and the septicemic, the blood. The bubonic plague, you could survive for a day or 2, probably, or 3, maybe. It'd be a pretty horrible death because your glands would all grow and they would get filled with pus and then they'd discolor before you eventually expired. The pneumonic or the septicemic, if you had to get plague, you might hope to get one of those because you probably wouldn't last the day out. The pneumonic, like the lungs, you die. The septicemic, your blood, and then your whole skin would kind of turn dark and black. So that's kind of the 2 reasons we call it the Black Death, because from the septicemic plague, it would discolor your skin, and from the buboes, so they burst and they would be discolored as well. They would be then a darkened color. That's where the term the Black Death came from. Now, it was not really caused by rats. You may have, if you've ever heard of the Black Death before, you say, oh, it came from the rats. It actually came from the saliva of fleas who lived on rats. And it came through the trading ports. That's why I said it first came to Genoa and Venice and Italy, the major ports of trade from the east, and then spread very quickly. We know what pandemics can be like today and how quickly they can spread. And the plague spread very quickly. And many major figures died. 1348, 1349. By 1350, it was quote unquote over. But it wasn't. Because the plague, pestis ursina, I think, is the Latin term for the bacillus that is designated the plague. Pestis is just a Latin term for plague. Was endemic as well as pandemic. It kept coming back. It was never again as virulent and as deathly as it was in this period of 1347 to 1350, but it was still there. Luther talks about the plague. He has letters. He answered one of his students, had become a pastor nearby, wrote him a letter. What do I do, Dr. Martin, about the plague? Should I flee? Should I leave? Should we try to get away from it? Or what should I do? And he said, well, basically, that's your call. He said, I'm staying here in my post. How best do you think you can minister to your congregation and your people? Now, again, it wasn't that virulent, but it was an issue that was still there, coming back. I think the last case of the plague was in 1714 in Marseille. There was a great outbreak in London in the 17th century. But again, never to the 14th century levels. It's a little bit like COVID, which I know is something we can all understand and relate to. That 1347 to 1350 period would be like the 20 through 2021 and 2019 through 2021 when we first start hearing about it, right? And then all of a sudden, boom, it's everywhere, and people are dying in droves, and bodies are stacked up. And then it'll come back again, maybe in another way, but it won't be nearly as bad. We have the vaccines and on the go, but it may be with us around for a while yet before it finally dies out. I don't understand enough about viruses to know what they actually are. Uh, that's another issue. But that's what I'm getting in terms of this seriousness. We're not even talking about one blip. We're talking about a long term impact over time, beginning in 1347, 48, and then returning. And people just learned to live with it. And they learned to try to figure out how to deal with it and then what caused it. They have their infections and spread, and certainly they knew it was infectious and they knew it spread. They weren't really sure how. They did not have virologists. They didn't have modern science. They were trying to rationalize, though, how could this have happened? We know it spreads by contact. We know it is probably in the air. So there was an issue of quarantining people, putting them aside in buildings or rooms and closing all the windows, closing all the doors because we don't want to let it get in, not realizing that's the opposite of what you should be doing. Another idea was it must be so common, it must be in the water, it must be some poison in the water. Like anthrax getting in the water supply or something like that because it was so widespread. But that soon went by the wayside because it's like, okay, well, how did it get in the water? They didn't really understand that type of issue. It was like, someone must be poisoning the water. Who would want to poison our water supply? And this kind of goes into reactions here and seeking causes. It's also, as I'll come back to in a moment, the idea was maybe it was the Jews who were poisoning the water. And I'll come back to that. But the problem there with that explanation was that Jews were dying too. So that doesn't make much sense. Now, so it's this unknown, which is the fear, the real fear. I don't know how old all of you are. I'm assuming that most of you were not around when AIDS first became an issue. Hasn't been forever. I still remember, the first talk about AIDS and people were dying of AIDS and no one knew what to do about it or how to prevent it or to cure it. And there was fear. It's like, oh my God, okay, we know some of the obvious causes, but what are the other causes? Can I catch it, just by using a public restroom? How, what is this thing? That fear was there. That fear was there. And that fear is what is so destructive and undermining until we learn how to handle it. Same thing with the plague. Same thing with COVID in some ways. Same thing with the plague. What is causing it? We don't know. Humans have always looked for rational explanations of things. Now, another problem. This high death rate might not have been all caused by the plague. And we don't have medical records from the time. So we have to reconstruct what we best think might have been the case based on what sources we do have, which are letters, which are treatises, which are documenting it. And so, think about it this way. People learned pretty quickly that if you associated or touched or were involved with someone who got the plague, you would probably get the plague too. So avoiding touching people was a problem. So if grandma comes home and goes into her room and wakes up and she's dead from the plague, she's plagued, infested. What do? So you call your priest and say, Father, please come take care of our poor dead grandma. So the priest comes, they go out, they bury her. And then the next day, the priest and those who had buried her were all dead from the plague. Pretty soon it's like, okay, we can't even bury the dead. Well, we don't want to just leave them in the house because that's not going to help for us. So what did they do? They ended up just like dumping them in the street. So you have these plague plague-infested bodies rotting in the street in the open. That leads to the development of more disease. So you have this very nasty situation going on. That also then increases death rates. We can't say that everybody who died between 1347 and 1350 died from the plague. Absolutely not. But it's that sense of what was going on. What do we do about it? And like, this is not right. When I say looking at the causes, it's okay, well, if we can't really say the Jews were poisoning the wells, even though we'll come back to that, what is the only example we have of plague? It's biblical. I mean, there was something called the Justinian's plague in the 6th century. How many people in the 14th century knew about Justinian's plague? Maybe a few scholars did, but not very many. But far more within the common understanding of knowledge and consciousness was the biblical plagues. Okay. Let my people go. Let my people go. No. Okay. Well, plague on your house. And plagues came. A series of plagues. And no, I'm not going to try to repeat all of them for you. We have the locusts. We have the darkness. We have, then finally the death of the firstborn. That was plague. Those were plagues. This is a biblical proportion. What must be causing this is God. And why would God cause plagues? Well, I've started inverting things. I just went back to check. I have anti-Semitism first, so I'll do that and then come back to this biblical aspect of it, if that's okay, if that makes sense. So I'll return to the biblical aspect, but that was the proportions it was put in. This is the biblical understanding. But that's why the anti-Semitism was there too, because the sense that Jews and Christians were at odds have been there all along. I mean, without question. In the 14th century, there had been, issues. I think I mentioned that in the context of the Crusades, we have a rise in anti-Semitism in the first ghettos and the first pogroms in Europe. And then it kind of dies down. The church actually always supported, institutional church always supported the Jews. They were seen as, still God's chosen people, and God had a plan for them in the end. They had to all kind of fit together. The lost tribes had to be found to come together. So all these world historical importance for the Jews were certainly there. But yet, so that underlying tension was there. With the plague, this waves of anti-Semitism increased. More pogroms once again. More attacks against the Jews because they were the enemies of Christ. They were the Christ killers. So we see these waves of anti-Semitism. And here, in light of the plague, we see another rise. Now, again, the church tried to stop that down, but yet the popular sentiment was there. And it was an ongoing problem. There was also, there's a great book called Rituals of Violence, Ritualized Anti-Semitism, that they kind of played out every Easter. And so, but there was a tension between the Jews within Christendom and Christians. And it wasn't all anti-Semitic, but there were these waves of anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism that would break out. And that was one. But as I said, that was not a widespread solution to why the plague came about, because Jews too were dying of the plague. And so that didn't make a great deal of sense. What made more sense for both was the biblical aspect of it. So then going from the anti-Semitism answer to why this is happening to the anti-clerical aspect. Because if this was a punishment of God, why would God be punishing us? What are we doing wrong? Well, I have up there, anti-clericalism. Anti-clericalism is just being against the clergy. It's not being against Christianity. It's not being against the papacy as such, but it's critique of the clergy, which could also include clergy critiquing the clergy. There was a conference, actually, as a graduate student, we had a conference on anti-clericalism, and one form of anti-clericalism is clerical anti-clericalism, which is an important concept to keep in mind for what is coming up when we get there. But it's like these priests aren't really doing their jobs. Now, there was conflict. I think I mentioned the development of the mendicant orders towards the end of last lecture. The Franciscans, the Dominicans, and the Augustinians, who were these new monastic orders that were seen to then go out to the cities to preach to the people, to engage in the active life, to minister, to offer the sacraments. And what would happen? They would establish their monasteries or their churches within cities. The Benedictines, the monks, would go outside the city wall into the forest and things, but the mendicants would go to the cities to preach. They're like original street preachers, so to speak. They would go to the city and preach, and they established their churches and their houses, and they started being in competition with the parish clergy. If you were, the normal scheme of things, you were obligated to go to your parish church. The priest of your parish church, you'd go there. That's where you attend mass. That's where you celebrate all the sacraments. That's where you'd be buried, and all along. But the mendicants were a new bunch. They were also well educated, usually better educated than the parish clergy. And it got to be a real competition for souls, and that's what it was. It was the lucra animarum, the opportunity to win souls. It was very much an economic issue, and so it became a point of we're not doing a sufficient penance. No, I was hemming and hawing there because I usually tell this long story behind it, and I'm trying to avoid going into all the details of it here and now. But let's just, as an example, if you're a Franciscan, let's say, and you are a Franciscan churches in your town, and you are thinking, okay, I'll go to my parish church. You go to your parish church, and you have to go to confession because you've done some really bad things. So you go in for a confession, and you say, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. He says, what is your sin, my son? And I said, oh, I have been lusting after my neighbor's wife. Oh, you shouldn't be doing that. No, I know. Um, you know, have you done anything? Have you acted on it? No, I haven't acted on it. It's like, well, that's so positive, and you must not do that because that is adultery and that is a grave, mortal sin. So, what's my penance going to be? Well, are you sorry for it? Yeah, I'm sorry for it. Try not to do. I'll try not to do it again. Okay, so for your penance, just to make sure that you won't, you have to do, say, 100 Paternosters, 100 Hail Marys, and you have to donate 10 florins, if you can, to the building of our new chapel in the church. It's like, wow, that's a lot, isn't it? Yeah. So you go, leave confession, and you're working on it, thinking about it. You go to the pub and you talk to a buddy. You're complaining about the penance that was just imposed on you, and he says, "You know what? You should go try the Franciscans. I hear that they give better deals." So you go to the Franciscan church, go in to confess. Say, forgive me, Father, for what I have sinned. What's your sin, my son? So I've been lusting after my neighbor's wife. Oh, that's one of the big ones. You shouldn't be doing that, right? Yeah, that's one of the commandments. He said, okay, well, have you actually acted on it at all? It's like, well, no, I haven't. Oh, good for you. Well, it's not a sin to be tempted. Temptation is not a sin. Temptation is just the state that we always live in. As long as you don't act on it, that's a positive. So let's see. If it's not a good thing, are you going to try to stop? Yeah, I want to try to stop. Okay. Well, good. Okay. Well, for your penance, then you should do 10 Hail Marys, 10 Paternosters, and you're good to go. Cool. I like the Franciscans. Now that started siphoning people off from the parish clergy. Another aspect, let's say are with the parish the whole time, and you've been going there. Your family's been going there all along. Your relatives are all buried there, and your spouse dies. I'm putting this in male terms. My apologies. At the time was male. Your wife dies, and so you go to your parish priest and say, excuse me, Father, I'd like to bury Martha, beloved Martha, and also would like to provide money for you to say a mass for her soul every week. The priest says, okay, well, you can bury her here. That's fine. You can pay the fee. You can bury her here. But I'm sorry, I'm pretty booked up in terms of masses. I can't fit another mass in a particular mass for Martha. Sorry, I just can't swing that. I'm just, So, oh well, I care about her. I want a mass to be said for her every week. Well, so you go to the Franciscans. Now, the Franciscan house would have like 25 to 30 people in it, maybe only even 15, but they're all priests. They're all ordained. So you go to the Franciscans and say, gosh, can I bury Martha here then? He said, well, can you pay her fees for it? Yeah, you can. And I'd like to endow a mass for her every week. Can you do that? Oh, no problem. We have lots of openings. So you go to the Franciscans. I'm pretty sure it's an economic problem in tension. It's a pastoral problem in tension. And what do we do about it? Especially if these mendicants are getting lesser penance. The feeling became like, oh my God, maybe this is the problem. Maybe this is why the plague has come, because we have too many sins which have not been absolved sufficiently. The priests are not doing their job. So if they're not going to do it, we're going to have to take it upon ourselves and do it ourselves. We're going to have to impose penance on ourselves. And there we have the flagellants. The flagellants were groups who would go around. They're called the groups of penitents, whipping themselves. That's called flagellation. It's not flatulation. It's not flatulence. It's flagellants. Beating oneself, whipping oneself, preaching the need to repent, because the clergy wasn't doing their job. They were failing us. And why was that? That we were, that failure of the clergy brought on this plague of God's punishment on us. Now, the institutional church, condemned the flagellants because you can see why. They're criticizing the institutional church. That feeling of something is really wrong here just grew and continued. Now, that's anti-Semitism. There's an element in that. This sense of anti-clericalism, which there were groups of monks too who were leading the flagellants at times. So it's not simply the laity over against the clergy as such, but it's still that sense that the established clergy were not doing their jobs, were failing the people. And the shock, because these are people you trust. These are people you go to with your deepest secrets, your most gut-wrenching problems and traumas. And they take you through your whole life, and they're supposed to guide you and lead you to the next life. And they are not doing their jobs and failing you, which jeopardizes what? Your eternal salvation. Yes, there's anger. There's a lot of anger. And then to have the institutionalized church come along and condemn that position just increases the anti-clericalism and the anger. How can they condemn what is so clear and evident to us, their own failure? Something wasn't working. And the plague, even though it wasn't nearly as virulent as later, still was around. And the issue of the penitence um, and the flagellants, the anti-clericalism, the anti-Semitism just continued, all of which circle around the issue of death. And yet, during all this period, we have another issue with regarding death, namely war. Well, it's not that Europe was constantly at war, but more or less they were on and off. Depends on what we mean by war. In 1336, we have the beginnings of what historians have identified as the Hundred Years' War. The Hundred Years' War is rather a misnomer. Why is that? Because it lasted for a bit. Well, not quite. I think I forget how exactly it's dated, 1336 to 1417 or something like that. But it wasn't a continuous battle between France and England. Those were the parties involved in the Hundred Years' War, the great battles of Crécy, Henry V, and on we go, all these Shakespearean dramas. Um, but France and England had been fighting each other for a long time, almost since the Norman invasion of William the Conqueror back in 1066. From that point on, there are tensions and issues. Part of the title of the King of England too was also King of England and of France. So there are issues and titles and struggles, and they have been fighting and fighting and fighting. And far before 1326, we'll see that in the next lecture. The English and the French are fighting. So the French are fighting with the Flemish, and it gets to be a real mess. Europe is not a peaceful place to be. Christendom was not a peaceful hokey dokey. Everything's all just fine. We're all Christian brothers. It was a problem. That's why the Crusades was a way for Urban II back in the 11th century to say, why are we fighting each other? We should go and fight the infidel. And I think I mentioned that the First Crusade was a great victory for the Christian forces, at least in their own eyes, obviously. It was horrific, but for them it was the glory of God showing their victoriousness. But thereafter, the crusading endeavors didn't work very well. In some ways, we can say the First Crusade was the only quote unquote successful crusade. So we have still the attempt to go on crusade, the calls for going on crusade, amidst the Christian princes fighting each other. And what do armies do when they're at war? It's not just that soldiers are killed. They go through towns and villages, raping, pillaging, and plundering. Soldiers still do that. Spoils of war, so to speak. It's inhumane and horrific, but that's what they do. And, everybody does it in one way or another. You say, well, we've never done that. Oh, yeah, well, I wouldn't say that's quite the case. But anyway, um, it's a matter of degree, maybe, but it's a problem. So we have increased death, battlefields that are not out there somewhere. They are within the area where you are living or traveling back and forth. If you're traveling between two towns, you see these people. Armies are coming through your town. It is very present. And this is at the same time that the plague is going on, that the famine had gotten over, but we'll come back to that in a second. But the effects are still there, and the anti-Semitism is on the rise, and the anti-clericalism is on the rise, and the world is just going to hell. What do we do about it? Well, I don't know. Actually, I'm looking back now on the war slide, and why I have heresy and papal imperial conflicts there, I don't know. To be quite honest, I think what happened there was I took the PowerPoint slides from one of my Western Civ lectures to you because I wanted to talk about these same topics. and then deleted a number of slides and revised and reformed or tried to reform and fix up that PowerPoint presentation for this lecture. I think I just forgot to get rid of the Crusades uh, and the Papal Imperial conflict, even though I did mention the Crusades and the ongoing crusading period that was throughout. We'll talk more about that too, because the Pope started calling, John the 22nd starts calling for a crusade against the Emperor. But that will be talked about in the next lecture, in lecture 2 for week 2, which is still all part of this crisis and adds to it, because it just goes on and on and on. But even with what we've seen here in heresy, yeah, we'll come back to heresy as well, because that shouldn't be there with the war. It was increasing uptick in heresy. I'll come back to that. I mean, the penitents were deemed heretical in that sense of, if you don't adhere to the approved Orthodox hierarchy, you were deemed as heretical. We had the first actually burning in 1310. So there are intense or increasing tensions and fears in terms of orthodoxy and right belief. And it gets to be a problem because all of a sudden now, if I get myself in trouble, maybe I can be uh, punished, even killed. I'll come back to that in another lecture. But even with just the war, the famine, and the plague, we have another rise in apocalypticism. What is apocalypticism? Technically, the term apocalypse simply means revelation. The last book of the Christian New Testament is called, the Apocalypse or Revelations. An apocalypse is a revelation. It's associated, though, with eschatology, because eschatology is the theological doctrine of the last times, the eschaton or the eschatah, depending on singular and plural. Every Christian theologian has an eschatology. Every Jewish theologian has an eschatology, even if that eschatology is one of there's nothing after this life, this is all there is, that's it. But what's going to happen at the quote-unquote end of the world? Apocalyptic eschatology is one form of eschatology, and that is the feeling of, I know when the end will be. Now, so apocalypticism has become associated with that sense of with a particular type of eschatology, an apocalyptic eschatology, in that it has been revealed, at least to me, when that end of the world is coming. And you know what? It's coming soon. Since the biblical times themselves. Jesus says, some of you will never taste death until I come again. That obviously didn't really happen. At least we have to interpret it really in a metaphorical sense to get beyond that. But there have been times of apocalyptic expectation that have been weighed by the failure of it to come about around the year 1000, the turn of the millennium. It was like, oh, maybe this is going to be it. This is the last times. People are still trying to identify, when the end of the world will be coming, and getting ready for it. And there's a whole almost field of study. I had a colleague, University of Liverpool, who studied some of these groups, and it's not just Americans. I mean, I always thought it's basically crazy Americans who are selling all they have and waiting for Jesus to come back. But there was a group in Britain. He told me about it, and these people are preparing for, and they still are preparing for Jesus's return. They have a house for him. All set up, ready to go, including with a shower. Because of course, when Jesus comes back, first thing he's going to do is come to this house, and he's going to need a shower. These are the kind of beliefs that, on the one hand, it's like, how can people believe that? But then it's fascinating to see how those beliefs come about. And that goes back to this issue of belief as an historical fact, or whether it's right or wrong or not. And I don't mean to be making fun of those people, but it's fascinating to me that that expectation, how they can believe it. It's not that they don't put their money where their mouth is, so to speak. They believe these things and they take steps to do so. There have been times in this country too, in the 19th and 20th century, and so when people have done the same thing, sold everything they have, gone off waiting for Jesus' return, and it hasn't come about. Now, my point here is, if you believed, if every one of you believed that the end of the world was coming, maybe this coming week, certainly by the end of the month, you believe that, how would that affect your life? How would you change how you lived, or would you? That's the impact of apocalypticism, meaning apocalypticism, i.e., an apocalyptic eschatology where it's been revealed to me, or at least to somebody whom I believe, that the end of the world is coming right away. That's why we have these movies, Apocalypse Now. Apocalypse is coming. The end of the world is coming. So apocalypse has become associated with the end of the world. But that's fine. I just want you to know the technical difference. It impacts you. And what Europeans were seeing within Christendom is this failure of the clergy. They were seeing a famine as they had never seen before. They were seeing plague as they had never seen before. And it seemed that the war was at a higher level. Famine, plague, war, and all this death all around them. And these are the four horses of the apocalypse. If you've read the book of Revelation or the Apocalypse, you will know that. The four horses that are unleashed. I don't think the cover of my book, Luther and the Reformation of the Later Middle Ages, is included in the page proofs. But on the cover, I chose this Albrecht Dürer, who was an associate of Luther, who did a lot of paintings dealing with Luther, and woodcuts, and I can tell more about him later. But he also did a woodcut for Luther to go along with one of Luther's books, The Four Horses of the Apocalypse. Or actually, no, Albert Dürer, 1498, so before Luther. Before Luther, my apologies. But that's the cover of my book. If you can see it, if it comes through at all. These are the four horses of the apocalypse. And that is the cover image I took because this apocalyptic expectation of belief the world is coming to an end was growing and intensifying. What does that mean? How does that affect one? That is a crisis. It's a crisis when you feel and believe that it's all crashing down and will be doing so almost at any moment when you see the four horsemen ride out. That's a crisis. That was this atmosphere of the later Middle Ages. Again, not by everyone, but a sufficient number of people were increasingly coming to that realization. What do we do? Now, they didn't sell all they had and go out and sit on a hilltop waiting for Jesus to return. But they knew it was the end. Time, too, of repentance. Do penance. Not only the flagellants, but then this whole other movement kind of fused to preach penance. Because repent, for the end of the world is at hand. You will be judged, and your eternal salvation will be determined. How do you live? That's the question we'll continue with actually next week. But there's another issue here too to add to all of this problems. That is the political aspect, the political crisis, the ecclesio-political crisis that also caused grave stress. It just exacerbated the general crisis. That's what we'll talk about next lecture. Thank you.